In the picture, the life and cultural milieu of Lucie Freud and her influence on her son Lucian. When I look back at my childhood with my grandmother Lucie, it's the look in her china blue eyes when we taught that I remember most, her devoted attention, and that she took the fulfillment of my needs seriously. After my parents separated, it was always with her that I felt at my most safe. It was in Walberswick on the Suffolk coast that she was happiest. The hidden house had a magical quality, with a massive living and dining room open to the rafters, and a large bay window overlooking the garden, where we took afternoon tea. Between the low divan and her graceful writing desk stood a large brass tub filled with sweet-smelling reeds and bulrushes. A balding tiger skin lay on the floor. A flight of stairs led to their bedroom in the eaves. At the back of the house were small rooms with bunks for the grandchildren, a galley kitchen, and a Spartan bathroom. The room I slept in was decorated with cut-out paper horses made by my father when he was a boy. Her country outfit usually consisted of a Chinese-style jacket and trousers in a dark blue cloth. The house was set in a narrow lane below the village green. A path led to the kissing bridge through the marshes, across a shingly waste, to the mouth of the River Bly, the dunes and the beach. We went there almost every day for walks, picnics, swims, to pick up starfish, fish for crabs and meet our friends. She would tell me stories of her childhood, her beloved governess, Manny, her sisters, her school days, her studies, and most of all of Hiddensee, the remote Baltic island where she had spent the summer holidays in the 20s and early 30s with her 3 boys, away from the increasing stresses of life in Berlin. Unlike the bohemian interiors of my mother's family, arranged with books, flowers, bowls of fruit, photographs, postcards, letters and drawings wedged into mirror frames, Lucie's London home in St. John's Wood appeared ordered in every detail, and everything had been designed precisely for its purpose by my grandfather. Every mother-of-pearl handled fruit knife lay in its baize-lined niche. Food was sent up from the kitchen to the dining room via a hand-cranked lift, neatly fitted into the glossy sideboard. My father's drawing of Loch Ness from Drumnadrochit hung above the divan. In town, Lucie always wore a formal wool or silk dress with a matching overjacket. For outings, she had a black Angora hat and a light net veil spotted with minute multicoloured pom-poms, and in winter, a fur stole around her shoulders, trimmed with a trio of tiny fox faces. The small, simply furnished living room was decorated in pale coffee-coloured velvet, and the walls were covered in a shot silk fabric. Her bedroom on the top floor was fitted with glass-fronted wardrobes lined with pleated muslin. My grandfather's spacious study, carpeted with plaited rushes, occupied the lower floor at the back of the house, overlooking the Japanese-style garden. A row of Zimmerlinder plants stood on the windowsill, casting a soft green light into the room. A Chinese bronze dragon stood in the fireplace with its paw balanced on a bronze ball. It was an unusually silent house. While in my mother's sitting room, Fischer Deskau's interpretations of Verlaine's poems played a full blast, eliminating the possibility of any other thought. The only music ever allowed in Lucie's was in Party Mood, the theme tune of the BBC's Music While You Work. My grandfather was a migraine sufferer and could not abide music of any kind. No one else I knew lived even remotely like they did. She often spoke to me about her studies in art history and classical literature at university, and of her fluency in the Latin and ancient Greek languages, something she was very proud of, although I did sense others yawning impatiently behind their hands. She gave me Ovid's Metamorphoses, Homer's Odyssey, Apuleius and the Golden Ass, and Herodotus's Histories, which she read aloud to me when I was still very young. I revelled in the meticulous descriptions of the customs and practices of the ancient world. I was half aware that these transformations, slayings, acts of hubris, couplings between gods, humans, and animals had an irresistible pull for her, and she fed my imagination with these stories, just as she filled my stomach with schnitzel and Kaiserschmarren. She told me that in the mythic times of ancient Greece, a young girl's beauty would have been measured by the quantity of olive oil required to fill her navel. Sometimes this would sidestep into tales of her own youthful adventures with men and the terror of an unwanted pregnancy. I recall a particular relish with which she told me of an evening stroll into the less salubrious backwaters of Venice, and the sight of a handsome young woman lifting her skirts in full view and urinating on the stone pavement while engaged in conversation with her friends. With the memories of Berlin's notorious Nachtkultur long behind her, was she somehow preserving her sense of herself as an uninhibited woman of the world, even if I was her only audience? I am reminded by my father's frequent repetition of Rochester's line, "There's something generous about mere lust." In my early childhood, Lucie's social demeanour was one of mildness, gaiety, and sympathy. She was interested in everything and everyone. The carpenter whose garden shed housed a museum of fossils, amber specimens, and strange objects washed ashore from shipwrecks, and whose tiny house was dwarfed by a beautiful pear tree, and Dinks, a notorious sexual predator. We were especially fascinated by the mouldy-looking squatter's house that stood in a blighted clearing in the woods, inhabited by an elderly shuffling couple who always averted their faces when we passed by. Both my grandparents spoke with pronounced yet mellifluous German accents. Parsley was parsley, Southwold was Southwold, money was money, like the painter, house was house, Annie was Annie, bathroom was bathroom, nightmares was nightmares, kitchen was kitchen. They sounded so foreign. Often they called me Putty, often Putchen, a term of endearment meaning cherub from the Italian. My grandmother was always rushing to the dictionary to look up a word. She was very fond of using English colloquialisms. Once, to my embarrassment, she asked me if I and my boyfriend were still as thick as thieves, placing great emphasis on the THs. She told me how she had made Ernst weep with laughter when she appeared in the doorway in a cloud of thick black smoke and said, "Methinks I've burnt the toast." Sometimes they spoke in German, usually when they were having an argument. Ernst would become annoyed when she put off getting dressed until long after breakfast, flitting round the house in her Chinese robe, her long coil of black hair with its thick stripe of white down her back. As I grew older, bolder, and cheekier, I called her old woman, and she called me, "You sickening brute," glaring at me in mock fury. Her photo albums are full of children running free, happy and beloved. She encouraged me, my sister and cousins to play naked in the garden, and she had a grassy hollow under a greengage tree we called the sun bath, where we rested in the afternoon. This was the 1950s, when nudity, even among children, was still widely regarded as somehow a little suspect or cranky at best. The culture in which my grandmother had spent her youth in Germany saw a great flowering of liberal ideas on the upbringing of children, women's rights, sexuality, social equality, freedom of expression in the arts, and the re-establishment of harmony between the natural world and the human body. There were many influential people writing on these subjects and journals promoting the beneficial effect of heliotherapy for those recovering from the traumas of the First World War, featuring curiously de-eroticized photographs of naked people. My grandmother would have subscribed to these ideals and considered herself a committed progressive. I wonder about the impact that the appropriation and corruption of these beliefs by fascism must have had on her. The affection of Sigmund Freud, her father-in-law, was enormously important to her. He saw her grace and beauty, her devotion to motherhood, her sense of style and her sweetness. To be so singled out by someone of the highest distinction gave her an unusual confidence, and during those long holidays, I became aware that she was practicing various strategies of her own to help her young granddaughters recover from their parents' separation and loss of their family home. It seemed to me that the id, the ego, totem and taboo, civilization and its discontents, etc., was much part of her everyday life as her favourite household brands, Omo, Brasso and Windowline. Food and its preparation occupied a primary position in her household. All meals required the meticulous laying of the table, and dishes were often elaborate, again something unusual at the time. Smoked eel or buckling were often served for breakfast. Tiny wild mushrooms, which grew plentifully on the village green, added luxuriness to her creamy sauces. However, in spite of this rich diet, I used to wake in the night and steal muscatels from her larder. When she found me out, she used to prepare midnight feasts for me and would wake me with tempting offerings. I believe that she was trying to instill in me the idea that whatever I wanted, all I had to do was ask. One summer, a young German woman named Margot came to work for her as an au pair. She was not expected to do much housework, but instead was there to be pampered and showered with attention as a surrogate daughter, and be carefully tutored by her in the English language. When the horrific facts of the Holocaust began to be more widely known, the girl's parents appeared one day at the door to take her home, saying that the shame they felt made it impossible for them to accept another day of her hospitality. My grandmother could not understand what they meant and felt only grief at losing the company of someone she had come to cherish. A phrase she often quoted to us children was non ruggere, neque detestare, sed intellegere, not to deride, not to curse, not to despise, but to understand, that Sigmund had borrowed from Spinoza at the cornerstone of his theory of the narcissism of small differences, and would often say aloud at his own family gatherings. For a long time I misunderstood its meaning. I thought that it was rather a priggish injunction against expressing emotions in favour of using the intellect. I understand now that what it means is that a dispassionate, even scientific approach to understanding human behavior is preferable to the all-too-human compulsion to shame and blame. But she took this a step further. In her close relationships, she embodied the belief that there was no such thing as wrongdoing, clandestine behavior, or even plain naughtiness. I have heard that my grandfather Ernst fancied himself as a businessman and as a result made some very ill-advised investments, such as acquiring a vineyard without the slightest knowledge of viticulture. I also know that my father was very wayward, rebellious, and risk-taking as a child, and that in spite of the terrible anxiety he must have caused her, she never criticized him or tried to correct him or showed anger to him. When he asked her for an unusually large sum of money to gamble with, she insisted that he was helping a luckless girl to get an abortion. My father hated that she saw everything he was and did, not just as good, but perfect in every way. It made him feel that she was suffocating him, and I witnessed many occasions when he reacted to her with fury. It became a terrible dynamic between them that would explode over the merest thing. During a break from sitting for a painting, we dropped by for a visit. She was an admirer of Lucie Freud's work, and she often bought small pots by her. On our arrival, she said, "I have a new pot by Lucie Freud." To which he replied, "I hate Lucie Freud. I don't want to see it." So she went to get it for us to admire. He said, "I told you I hate Lucie Freud. I didn't want to see it. I still hate it, so you go and get it. We're going." It pained me to see her standing in the hallway in mute distress. As I grew up and my dependence on her lessened, my father's apparent and much harped-on contempt for her skewed my perception of her until I began to see her as a gullible, submissive figure. It seemed to me that her entire life had been slavishly sacrificed to the pleasure and comfort of others. I remember feeling rather dismissive when in later years she and Ernst laboured on the enormous task of translating, editing and publishing of Sigmund Freud's diaries and letters. I think it was the expression of her blatant favouritism towards my father over his brothers that caused him the most pain. He found it ugly, ignorant, demeaning, and immoral. Although it was very visible to me, I have only recently understood something of the consequences of her behaviour by listening to the recollections of my cousin Carola Zentner, who throughout her life was very close to Lucie, her dream aunt. She describes how as Lucie's two younger sons grew up, they forged themselves into agents provocateurs, constantly in competition for her attention, and how, whatever Clement wanted, he made sure he got it, by fair means or foul, while Lucian got away with everything. Anything that Clement had, did, or represented, a quotable quote, boutiques, honours, estates, connoisseurship, celebrity, my father vehemently repudiated. Given what I know of my father's temperament, it seems perfectly logical that he admired John Rochester, Honoré Daumier, Charles Huysmans, Oscar Wilde, George Byron, Alfred Jarry, Franz Kafka, Constantine Cavafy, William Hogarth, Patrick Kavanagh, Jean Rhys, Cab Calloway, T.S. Eliot, Fats Waller, and Edith Piaf. I remember one summer he used to pick me up in an Austin Mini with a record player on the dashboard that belted out Bob Dylan's Positively 4th Street over and over again. You got a lot of nerve to say you are my friend. When I was down, you just stood there grinning. You got a lot of nerve to say you are my friend. You just want to be on the side that's winning. All the same, I used to wonder why my father made so much of his enmities and seemed to put so much of himself into hating people, particularly those he had once loved. Phrases like, jealousy is the barometer of love, there's no such thing as free will, and I'm stimulated by conflict, came from him as regularly as clockwork on almost every visit. He once told me that he admired the French for their capacity to insult. When he showed me painter working reflection, he said that it had to do with the words of "Do not forsake me, O my darling," from High Noon, for I must kill the man that hates me, or lie a coward in my grave. 12 years after my mother and Win, my stepfather, got married, my sister Eve was born. There was much rejoicing. On the day of the christening, Lucian sent Win a telegram that read, "Congratulations, I didn't know you had it in you." When Lucian arrived later in the afternoon for the christening party, he was not allowed into the house. I realized that he was insistent that I got it, his version of himself. To some extent, as his eldest daughter, I paid a high price for Lucy's distortions of him. During my childhood, outings with my father would include stopping by the betting shop. Sometimes he would emerge quids in, jangling his keys in triumph, and at others white-faced with anxiety after a big loss. It is well known that he attributed his compulsion to gamble to the relief he felt at being cleaned out, as he put it. While I'm sure that these were his true thoughts and that losing everything was a spur to his incredible self-discipline, there is little evidence of relief as far as I saw it. He didn't want relief, he wanted stimulus. There is no doubt in my mind that gambling was a way of purging his mother's influence, and sometimes he would talk to me quite sadly about how she made him feel. It is also generally known that by the early 1930s, Sigmund Freud was viewed as an enemy of the Nazi Party. As a precaution, my grandparents engaged bodyguards to take their sons to school. The memory of that must also have played a part. As she grew older and Ernst's malady worsened, she confided in me that she was suffering from depression and had lost interest in cooking. Things fell into disuse. The London house began to look faded. When Ernst died in 1970, she did not tell her sons for some days, handling the arrangements for the disposal of Ernst's remains alone before attempting suicide. Without Ernst to protect her, was the prospect of facing her warring sons too frightening for her. She was found by her sister Gerda, or Gaga as everyone called her, who took over her care. Some years later, when Gaga needed a holiday, she spent some weeks at Carola's house and seemed to take pleasure in their closeness and the house full of young children, eventually returning home to 32 St. John's Wood Terrace, where she lived on for another 10 years. But by then she was a cardboard cutout of her former self. The overdose must have caused some lasting damage. The house in Walberswick was sold without a backward glance. On the occasion of my first marriage in 1974, my father came to meet me in Reims, where I was living with my fiancée, and from there in our wheezy 2CV to Châlons-en-Champagne for the wedding. Lucie flew over the next day. At the prenuptial supper with my in-laws-to-be, at which she did not utter a word, my father watched entranced as she suddenly rose from her chair and crushed a moth between her clapped hands. On the walk back into town, he confided that he'd organised a getaway car should I change my mind at the last minute. Arriving in darkness at the Hôtel d'Angleterre on the Place de la République, he shinned up the drain pipe to his room while she stood on the street in her grey silk gown, entreating him to come down and behave himself. I had the sense of a scene played out many times before. In a telegram sent a few days later, he wrote that my wedding had been like being an extra in a marvellous French film. The Painter's Mother Resting, 1976, is the portrait of her that I find the most compelling. Seeing it on his easel, I asked him how he was able to portray the paisley motifs on her dress. He replied that he treated each one as entirely individual. 25 years later, unable to erase their embracing forms from my mind, I used them to make an embroidery. When I used to visit her in St. John's Wood Terrace, she would sit in Ernst's chair at his desk and never spoke except with the utmost brevity in answer to my questions. But when required to do so, she was able to rise to the occasion. One night, some years after Ernst's death, by which time my father was making portraits of her, we were in his car on our way to have dinner with Alfie, his friend and bookmaker. There was some conversation about where we were going and who was going to join us. My grandmother interposed with, "I am not in the picture." He looked at her sitting in the passenger seat in her massive brown fur coat and said, just audibly and hoarse with emotion, "You're in all the pictures." In that moment, he was declaring his acknowledgement of her importance to his art and to every aspect of himself.